Well, good morning, everybody. It's just 11 o'clock. Welcome to today's event, which is the third in a five-part event series we are running ahead of the government's much anticipated white paper, levelling up white paper, which is currently scheduled for autumn. What part of autumn, we don't know, but autumn nevertheless. Each of the events that we are doing is taking different aspects of the levelling up agenda and then trying to reveal and then explore some of the dilemmas and tensions and trade-offs associated with them. I think one of my observations of the levelling up debates thus far is that very few of them accept that there are some dilemmas and tensions and trade-offs, in a sense that it's the classic, we can do everything everywhere all at the same time, seems to be part of the debate. And whilst that would be lovely, it's unfortunately not true. So trying to get at some of these issues where we will need to make some choices, where priorities will need to be undertaken is part of the ethos of the remit of this five-part event series. And the issue today that we're going to focus on is innovation. So the role of innovation in the levelling up agenda. And we've got two fantastic speakers to explore those issues with us, and I'll introduce them in a second. But as always, before we start, a few words of housekeeping. So the event is being recorded and will be made available on our website after the event. During the event, your microphones will be kept on mute. If you want to tweet about it, the hashtag is levelling up dilemma. There will be opportunity to ask questions of our speakers. You don't have to wait until they've finished. You can post them at any time. And you do that via the chat function, and you'll see there's a channel called Ask a Question. So just post your question in there. When we get to questions, if time allows, I'm sure it will, we do like you to ask your question if possible. So just be prepared for that. Obviously, if you prefer me to ask it, that's also fine. Just let us know when you post it, and we'll be done by 12 o'clock. So let's get going. Let me introduce our two speakers. Our first speaker is going to be Diana Beech. Diana is Chief Executive of London Higher, which is the body representing more than 40 universities and higher education colleges in London. And then following Diana will be Tom Forth. Tom is the co-founder of the Data City. He's an associate of ODI Leeds, active blogger, and very active member of the Twitter community. And so once we've heard from Diana and once we've heard from Tom, then we'll get into a bit of a conversation, and then we'll open it up for questions from you. So without further ado, Diana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. And of course, thank you to Andrew and the team for inviting me to share my thoughts at this event this morning, where we're going to be focusing on the aptly named hashtag levelling up dilemma. Now, as you just heard, I'm the Chief Executive of London Higher, which represents over 40 universities across Greater London. So needless to say, I'm going to be banging the drum a little bit for the role of the higher education sector in helping us achieve our levelling up ambitions. And of course, I'm going to be urging us all to think a little differently about the role and place of London and of course the South East when it comes to addressing regional imbalances in UK R&D. Now, I've only got 10 minutes in which to share my reflections. So if you'll excuse me, I'm just going to focus on three main points, and then hopefully we can open up into other topics and areas in the discussion afterwards, particularly after Tom has spoken as well. And needless to say, I am daunted going before Tom. So I am going to kick us off then, and I'm going to start with the first of my levelling up commandments, if you like, and that is, if we're serious about levelling up, then we first got to be seen to be fessing up about what levelling up really means. And what I mean by that is, although the levelling up ambition isn't unique to this government, it's certainly something that this government has been able to latch onto and to own as its own after its successes in the 2019 general election. But what does it mean? Well, we know from various speeches and pledges that levelling up means delivering opportunities for people across the regions. And we also know it means increasing prosperity in the so-called left behind parts of the country. But we don't actually know much more than that. we haven't been told much more than that. And even though the Prime Minister just gave a major speech on levelling up as recently as this July, I think it was, the levelling up agenda still, I think, appears to be quite vague and disjointed. And I would argue much more seriously that to those of us in London, the levelling up agenda is already appearing quite a threat and something to distrust. After all, it was in this July speech that the Prime Minister tried to reassure Londoners and those in other big cities across the UK that the government doesn't want to level down. He said, and I think these are his exact words, let me dig them out, we don't want to decapitate the tall poppies. We don't think you can make the poor parts of the country richer by making the rich parts poorer. But then, less than a week after that, the government authorised a blanket cut to the London weighting element of the public teaching funding for the capital's universities. They proclaimed it to be unjustifiable to give extra money to London under current levelling up plans. So you could say then that London's tall poppy had just had its first public prune. And this is despite the government fully acknowledging that operating costs are higher in the capital than anywhere else, and the fact that London is home to some of the most disadvantaged communities, not just in England, but across Europe. I think most strikingly, it also ignores the catastrophic effects that COVID-19 pandemic has had on London. For example, in March this year, and I admit that was quite a few months ago now, the Centre for Economics and Business Research calculated that COVID's cost the London economy more than £50 billion in lost output since the start of the first lockdown. And I think just yesterday, it was reported that London remains the one region of the UK where employment remains well below pre-pandemic levels. So not everything's rosy here in the capital, and Londoners need their fair share of levelling up too. But so far, it seems more convenient for the government to play popular politics, if you like, and to keep London out of the equation altogether. And that's why you can't really blame London's universities in particular for fearing similar cuts could yet be made to the national R&D funding pot. And although we all acknowledge, we'll all put our hands up that the capital gets the largest share of public UK R&D expenditure, if any attempts were to be made to level this down, the missing billions, to coin a phrase, are not going to be replaced overnight with money from other sources, particularly not now, given the grave impacts of the pandemic. And it seems to me that when it comes to talking about London, it's like COVID never happened. And there's a real risk that policymakers will apply models and theories that may well have been appropriate to the dominance of London and other big cities before COVID, but which could now leave the city and the nation far worse off. You'd think it common sense that effective policies are the ones that are appropriate to their time. They address today's challenges and they're based on today's realities. So I think cutting money from London at a time when it needs to rebuild, let alone improve how it operates, is a policy made for the pre-pandemic glory days, if you like, and it would only further dent the capital and the nation's recovery were it to be pursued now. And that's not to say that I'm trying to shirk London's responsibility to attract more private R&D investment. The capital's institutions have long recognised that they need to do much, much more to bring in private money. And London's universities and research institutes are certainly stepping up and working hard to boost things like the commercialisation of their R&D activities, to encourage entrepreneurship amongst their students and their staff, and to increase academic and industry links. And just to give you some examples of that, 1 in 7 graduates from Middlesex University are now becoming entrepreneurs, and the university runs an established startup programme to bring ideas to market as quickly as possible. And the University of Westminster as well is also home to a creative enterprise centre, and that aims to accelerate innovation amongst their students. So the capital's modern and technical and vocational universities are certainly stepping up to the London productivity challenge. But we do need to be realistic here. As I said, change won't happen overnight, particularly as the global economy recovers. And any rash decision to cut research money from the capital in the next spending round, which I realise is looming, will severely hamper London's research potential. And more pressingly for the levelling up agenda, it will have knock-on effects on the impacts and outputs elsewhere in the country as well. And it's this thought that takes me on to my second levelling up commandment of the morning, and that is, what's done and funded in London doesn't always stay in London. Yeah, unlike Vegas, which keeps its deep, dark secrets to itself, London is an open and a collaborative city, and the capital's universities and research institutes are often part of larger consortiums or research projects which seek to influence and improve conditions elsewhere in the UK. And as the Vice Provost for Research at UCL proudly told me, when it comes to levelling up, we shouldn't be looking crudely at where the money goes, but where the output flows. And all credit to Professor David Price for that catchy strapline. But it's true. Until now, I guess it's been somewhat taken as a given that London's largest universities will operate not just within the capital, but nationally and also internationally as well. Yet with the government's focus increasingly turning to the domestic, to areas outside London and the southeast, it's time that we make this explicit. And London's universities have started to map their national impact, particularly in other regions. And again, just to give you some examples, UCL has just appointed its first Pro-Vice Provost for the UK, and they'll be focusing specifically on capturing domestic impact activities. And I'm sure many of you would have already seen the interactive map produced by Imperial, which attempts to show just how far the benefits of the college's research reaches into communities outside of London. So I think criticising London for receiving a high amount of public R&D funding misses the point that London's research performing institutions have proven themselves able to achieve substantial impact with this investment. And having well-funded London institutions and those from other big cities as part of larger national bids is to everyone's benefit, as they can use their soft power to amplify impact, be it through budget and project management skills, or the ability to generate and attract precious match funding, the elephant in the room. This in turn not only takes some of the burden off some of those newer research partners, if you like, and they're perhaps still in the process of developing their research potentials and credentials, but it also allows them to learn from the larger big city players. So what we're seeing is not actually London or other big city dominance, but those cities actually stepping up as part of a civic duty to help other towns and regions and the country as a whole. And I think, or I hope, most of us in this virtual room today would agree with the suggestion that as money becomes scarcer, as it will after the pandemic, the government should focus its R&D spending in places where it's most likely to have impact. And that means London and other big cities need to be part of the equation too, not just as places where innovation is already happening, but as guaranteed sources of impact that will be felt right across the country. And I think that takes me on to my third and final commandment of the morning, and that's, if we want levelling up to work, then we need to focus on need, not geography. Excluding certain cities and communities from investment, or worse still, actively removing this investment based on geographic location alone, is a very, very crude way to implement policy, and it overlooks pockets of genuine need. You don't need me to tell you that not all of London's streets are paved with gold, and in the same way that not all of the north is impoverished. I think seeing things in such a binary way is insulting to everyone involved, and investing and disinvesting public money along crude north-south divides oversimplifies a problem that we're trying to fix. In the case of R&D policy, it also ignores the respective strengths and linkages of the individual regions, as I've just explained. Now, while I recognise that the UK isn't multinodal like Germany when it comes to having distinct research regional strengths, it does at least have parts of the country which are better set up to produce certain things than others. So in London, for example, it's clear that Createch, that's a new word for research and creative technologies, is bringing great benefits to both the capital and the country at large. And that's why it's in our interest in London to invest in the capital's creative industries, to boost productivity and growth in the region, and to play to London's unique sort of R&D strengths. But in any other region of the country, I admit that will mean investing in something else, like it could be pharma, or it could be AI, or it could be robotics. Levelling up through research ultimately relies on building research strengths within regions, across regions, and between regions. And when it comes to tackling the grand challenges, not least climate change, it means making sure we're being as inclusive as possible and not excluding any region from our master plan, if you like. After all, if we're serious about net zero and achieving clean growth, then London and other big cities need to be part of the solution too. We're not going to go green through R&D, even if we've got the best R&D in the planet, without our big cities being involved, because they are the home of the problems that we're trying to fix. So they have to be part of that too. So for me, I think the way forward should be all about shining a light on particular research capabilities within the regions and linking them better both to our local needs and our national priorities. And these local needs need not be in the region itself, but elsewhere. And universities do have a key part to play in each of these regional R&D ecosystems. And in many ways, I think it's universities which help to embed in the research process the civic aims and missions, which help to spread these benefits to other parts of the country and to allow for partnership with other public and private sector bodies. So just to conclude then, I think investing fairly in R&D shouldn't be a binary choice between excellence or equity or north and south or between arts and science. It's about making the whole system work and tweaking different things in different regions according to need, not geography. And I think it's only when each regional cog of the UK R&D system starts to turn at the same speed will levelling up succeed. And at that point, I'm going to hand over to Tom.
Brilliant. Diana, thank you very much indeed. Good three commandments, lots in there to explore in a bit more detail. And let me just re-emphasize this point that you made several times. If only our other big cities were dynamic, prosperous hubs of the economy, the nature of the levelling up conversation would be radically different in this UK. The central problem in many respects is that unlike London, most of our other big urban areas outside of the Greater Southeast don't perform in the way that they do in most other international comparators, and that's part of the problem. So I definitely come back to that, and I like your idea around thinking about potential, but that in a sense creates a dilemma, right, about how do you identify potential, how far down the rung do you go. So I'll come back to you on your thoughts on that. But Tom, your thoughts on the dilemmas and tensions associated with the role of innovation in levelling up. Tom.
Thanks very much. So I think the fact that no one has ever defined what levelling up means causes us a huge amount of problems. Although if I were a politician, I'd do the same. So fair enough to them. You don't say what it is, it can be everything to everyone. So I think it's quite important probably to say straight up front that I don't think innovation spending and R&D is likely to reduce poverty in any meaningful way anywhere in the UK within decades. After 20, 30, 40 years, we might see some of that. But I don't think that hiring twice as many professors at UCL is going to do anything to reduce poverty in Tottenham. And I don't think that having twice as many people developing drugs at AstraZeneca in Macclesfield is going to do anything for people living in poverty in Wythenshawe in South Manchester. So I don't think that we should be looking very hard at innovation funding as anything to do with reducing poverty. Instead, we should be looking at it as a way to level up the economies of places. And your point is obviously one that I completely agree with, Andrew. This I think Centre for Cities put out something last week on this, looking at how well do large urban areas, cities of the UK do compared to their natural comparators, which are cities in Europe and North America. And what we see is that we have this one fantastically successful global city, London, and its greater southeast, which I think to some definitions can extend up to 15, 20 million people. Depends how far you're willing to come in to the office. And that does reasonably well, not fantastically well, but reasonably well in terms of international city economies and the strength of the economy and the ability to create good jobs and effectively create tax that can be then spent on other things. And then you look at the other large cities of the UK, whether it's Glasgow, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, and they just do very poorly. So to me, levelling up is all about how can we take the cities and the places in the UK that do poorly by international comparisons, and that's the strength of their economy, and make those economies strong enough such that we have enough money to get people out of poverty. Ultimately, I don't think that new widgets and people in lab coats and innovators in creative industries are going to be a big part of getting people out of poverty. The taxes they pay, and let's tax them more, probably, the taxes they pay will get people out of poverty. And hopefully in 30, 40 years, through better education, we get them doing those jobs. That's your dream. But I don't believe poverty will be impacted that much by innovation. So I suppose in terms of innovation spending, what's the dream? What's the best outcome for me? I believe in spending the money to generate the biggest economic return so that we can tax it and get good outcomes from the spending that tax allows us to have. What would be the best option for the UK? The best option is to take our two leading cities for innovation spending. That's Oxford and Cambridge. That's the places where the private sector spends a huge amount on innovation. and the public sector spends a huge amount of innovation, and we generate fantastic things like the AstraZeneca vaccine against COVID. And so no one's saying we shouldn't have that. We want more of it. The best thing would be to make each of them 2 million people. Now, Andrew's had a bit of a laugh there. And there's two reasons why we laugh, because we know that in the UK, we would never allow it to happen. And there's a second part of that, which is we know that we won't allow it to happen. Oxford will never become a city of 2 million people in our lives, nor will Cambridge. So since it won't be allowed to happen, we can't think about it, but also it wouldn't do anything to do with levelling up. It wouldn't help make Manchester or Leeds economies that much stronger. So let's not do it. So what do we do instead? We're on to our second best option here. The best option doesn't exist. What's our second best option? Well, what it turns out is that we can spend some money on R&D. That's in research institutes, in businesses, and at universities. The government can spend that money in order to try and create more activity, new businesses, innovative businesses, businesses that are more productive. Clearly, if you have a new product as a business that's better than the competition, you will be more profitable, be able to pay higher wages, pay more tax, that kind of thing. And we kind of know that this works. We know that this works because about 30, 40 years ago in Germany, there was a huge economic problem. They had a problem whereby the east of the country was extremely poor, having just emerged from communism, and it had a very rundown industrial base. A huge amount of money was transferred from the west of Germany to the east of Germany. And the dream was that over time, the east of Germany would become less reliant on the west, that it could pay more of its own way. And that has worked. So we see that East Germany today is less reliant on the West than it was 30, 40 years ago. It would have been hard to be more reliant, but we still see a really big improvement. And a few years ago, East Germany's economy overtook North England's economy in terms of industrial strength. So we've got to this stage where communism has been undone, and all that's left is a failure to develop the economy of North England, which is now greater than the after effects of communism. So it's quite an indictment of UK policy there. So we know that if we spend a lot of money on R&D in a place, we can help to generate some economic growth. My suspicion is that it would work to do about 10 to 20% of the gap that we have. It's not going to solve everything, but it probably will do some good. We can see that in Germany. We see it at smaller scales in other places. In the Netherlands, in the south of the Netherlands, where they used to mine coal, they closed all of their coal mining equipment, and they closed a lot of steel factories and quite a lot of chemical factories. Again, the Dutch government spent a lot on R&D via research institutes and universities in the south, and it helped in part to regenerate that economy. So I think that there's some opportunities to do that. There's two parts that I'll kind of end with us thinking about, which is, should we just spend everywhere? So me and Richard Jones did a big paper looking at, we called it the missing 4 billion. The 4 billion was the amount of money that we felt the UK government would need to spend in order to bring the UK up to its supposed target of spending 2.4% of GDP on R&D. So we need to spend, the UK government needs to spend about 4 billion more. And we were saying, where should we spend it? And one of the nice things about the UK government promising to spend more was that we didn't need to cut funding anywhere, since generally cutting funding on R&D spending would be a bad idea. We don't spend too much on R&D in London. We spend about right. We don't spend too much on R&D in Oxford and Cambridge or Edinburgh. We spend about right. It is about levelling up the R&D funding, not moving it from one place to the other. I'm willing to make an exception to that if Oxford continues to refuse to build any homes at all. In that case, take the money. But that's my exception to the rule. So we should probably be looking to spend money, the government, on R&D in places where business spends money. That's because I think business is quite clever. I think that business probably spends money in places where it thinks it will generate the best return. Business spends a lot of money on R&D in Oxford and Cambridge. Fantastic. The state should stay there spending a lot of money on R&D. Business also spends a lot of money on R&D in the Northwest, places like Cheshire, and Cheshire extends into Liverpool and Manchester. Having recently lived in Manchester, I can tell you that most of Cheshire is part of Manchester. They will deny it, but they are. So you've got a lot of private spending on R&D in Cheshire, which is Liverpool and Manchester included. and in the West Midlands. So that's Birmingham, Coventry, and all around those industrial cities. And what's really notable and unusual in the UK, it's a very strange thing that no other country seems to have, is the private sector is spending a lot on R&D in these places. They want to invest in new technologies and growth and new ideas that generate improved businesses and higher profit margins and better wages and better jobs for more people. And the state is largely absent. The UK state is spending about half what we would expect given their level of private sector spending if we were in another country or if it was a place like the southeast of England. So the place where me and Richard argued the missing 4 billion should go is we should target the spending on extra R&D that the government could do to the places where business is spending a lot on R&D and the government is currently spending very little. And when you look at where that should happen, 3 places stand out. As I've said, the West Midlands, we should just be pouring money into Birmingham. They will actually get a high-speed railway, so it should be Greater London soon enough. So fair enough, that solves all of our problems. The Northwest, so that's Cheshire and in its broadest sense, Cheshire all the way to Preston, pretty much. So it's a huge area of genuine strength. And I'll get myself into even more trouble because Cheshire does, in effect, stretch all the way here to Leeds. I mean, at the east end of this area of high innovation and high R&D and business, that includes Bradford as part of Lancashire, right? Now, again, I'll get the hate mail, but pretty much economically speaking, you can drive from Bradford to Burnley, not very long at all. It's easier than most commutes in the southeast. And then the third place, which kind of surprised me, and this is one of the advantages of working with data a little bit, is it does kick you in the face and say you're wrong. Northern Ireland has done really well on supporting private sector R&D. And it still doesn't have a great deal of UK government spending. And there are political reasons why the UK government should be supporting and helping out Northern Ireland. But just on a purely economic basis, you see the amount of private sector R&D that's happening in Northern Ireland, and you think we should help them out. That is a really good return on investment if we do that spending. So the last thing that I'll end on to make everyone, wind everyone up a little bit, is to say where we shouldn't spend money on R&D. Because the argument could be, well, we know R&D generates growth, therefore we should spend it everywhere and generate growth everywhere. And I don't think there's much reason to believe that. I don't believe that spending money on R&D everywhere will generate the equal amount of growth everywhere. Really, I suspect that the state should be spending money where business is spending money. And I'll actually be very generous to London in this regard. London does not have high business spending on R&D. It's a real enigma in the world whereby the public sector spends a huge amount on R&D in London and the private sector spends very little. But I suspect that actually a lot of the products of London's great R&D machine happen to set up their base in Reading, Slough, Guildford, Brighton, somewhere that's not London when you draw the line around London, but kind of is. It's close enough. It's where people who did a lot of work there. So I suspect London doesn't do as badly, but we do have these opportunities. Birmingham, Manchester, Glasgow would be 3 that you would go for, and Belfast, of course, as well. The challenge would be, what about Blackpool? The challenge might be, what about Scarborough? What's R&D spending going to do for Scarborough, Blackpool, Cornwall? And there, I think we just have to be brutally honest about it. We have no very good reason to believe that significant state spending on R&D in those places will generate a big increase in innovation that increases the productivity of businesses. And that's because businesses are not currently spending money there. So those places, we shouldn't abandon them at all. It's just that R&D is not their path to having a stronger economy. They have many other options for having a stronger economy. I wouldn't use R&D spending and innovation funding to do it. I would focus on the 4 or 5 big cities in the UK that currently have high business spending on R&D and currently have low UK government spending, and just spend more there. And for most places as well, most towns or smaller places, that's going to include them. I mean, Warrington is probably one of the cities/towns in the UK with the most spending on R&D. It's a fantastic, thriving, growing, strong economy. And that's because it's between Liverpool and Manchester, and you can be in London in less than 2 hours. It's a great place to be. If you look at Rotherham is, we have this advanced manufacturing research centre, a great success of UK industrial strategy. It's just as close to Sheffield as it is to Rotherham. And you probably can live anywhere within 20 miles and be there. So if we're looking at what about Barnsley, what about Rotherham, what's about Warrington, what about Wigan, what about Bolton? The answer is pretty simple. These are all part of these large innovation ecosystems where investing anywhere in them will probably generate a good return. And we should be looking for each place to decide where it wants to invest. And you'll find some fantastic opportunities. When we worked in Great Manchester, we found this opportunity in Salford, for example, to spend a huge amount on building technologies. You could spend pretty much hundreds of millions of pounds, and I suspect it would generate a great return. So those are my things to end with. I think innovation won't do much for poverty, so let's not worry about innovation and poverty. Let's tax the proceeds of innovation and use that to solve poverty. I think we should be looking to spend money where business spends money, because markets are clever and businesses are clever. So the UK government should be just checking that it's spending in similar geographies to where business is. And I suppose the last thing is, on a conciliatory note, is we really shouldn't be talking about cutting funding to any place that currently has high R&D funding. And as long as we spend more, which the UK government has promised to spend more on R&D, and the UK government is very good at keeping its promises, I'm sure that we won't need to have any levelling down of funding to achieve a more equitable mix.
Brilliant. Tom, superb, as always. I look forward to the development plans where Oxford and Cambridge grow to 2 million plus. Apparently they're imminent. Any second now we will be receiving them, and we can mark them with due regard. So there's loads in there. We've had quite a few questions. A few of them have been asked or asking me to ask them. But Dan, I want to come back to you first. So so the first dilemma, I think, or tension, which you alluded to, maybe I took a slightly different view of Tom, was, that spending in universities or spending on R&D can do good for the broader economy of that kind of place. And Tom's slightly more skeptical about that, or uncertain about that. So there's a dilemma there that we're overreaching in what we think London can do in your instance, or what innovation can do. Do you agree with that, or do you not see that as a potential problem? Because if you don't deliver on that, then everybody gets disgruntled and disappointed. So Diana, come back to me on that.
Thanks, Andrew. And just to react to what Tom said, I hope he is right in the fact that nowhere needs to be levelled down when it comes to the next sort of spending round. With regards to the question, I think where Tom and I do converge is, I will obviously say that universities can be a big part in the R&D picture, but that is because they primarily attract the business and the enterprise that Tom is talking about. And I think universities increasingly, of all shapes and sizes and of all ilks, are really trying to step up that, as I said before, that sort of commercialization effort, creating incubation hubs, creating science parks, creating innovation districts. And that is all very much part of the sort of anchor institution civic university role, which has really taken ground, I think, in the past couple of years, and all credit to the UPP Foundation for starting that off. I think it was about 4 years ago now, which makes me feel old, but it was in this government's manifesto to increase the civic identity, and I think that is all part of civic. It is boosting those sort of business parks. So I think that's where we do converge. Yes, getting lots of highly paid academics might not be the be all and end all to boosting prosperity, but it's the spin-off jobs that they create. We need to think bigger, and we also need to think about the spin-offs they have in terms of, I don't know, addressing health inequalities or educational inequalities, and that's, I think, how R&D can have the sort of levelling up power in some of the regions that Tom mentioned, like the Scarboroughs or, coastal areas. Yes, maybe they're not going to become R&D hubs in themselves, but they're going to get those knock-on benefits 10, 20, 30 years down the line of having research done in their localities.
I agree with that, but just to push you or not, and just get Tom's reflection on it as well. So I think the point you make, which is R&D spend, we want more R&D spend in the country. We're poor compared to, our peers internationally. We spend less, however you kind of define it. I think what I'm interested in is, particularly in the leveling up context, seems to me that the pitch is that innovation spend in a place A, has direct economic benefits for place A. And I'm more skeptical of that, rather than investment in place A, the spillovers are very large, and essentially those benefits get felt in lots of different places. Actually, in some respects, not in place A, in many other places. I would argue that you see those and there's a conflation of that, direct spend in a place A benefits place A directly across the piece. I think is where I would suggest there's a tension that is not fully thought through. Your thought on that, and I'll get Tom to come back in.
Okay, well, if I kick off, I think this is where we need to look at sort of the innovation ecosystem in each region. So, of course, at London Higher, I represent 40 universities, from the big research-intensive sort of Russell groups and research institutes of their own, through to modern technical universities. And each of them has their different place in that place A and place B that you just spoke of. The more local universities, if you like, will be doing local research, predominantly with the local researchers and for local people. So that kind of research will have a benefit in the local place. But the bigger players, the more national, the global names, international, will be doing that research that has the power to impact elsewhere. And I think that's why we need to foster on our local innovation system. There is a role for every different player, and we need to make sure we've got that balance right. So that's sort of my perspective from London.
Okay, Tom, you just expand on that a little bit more. I know your kind of Sheffield AMRC, Sheffield Rotherham AMRC is a good one. When we look for local benefits of that centre, they're pretty small. I mean, they're not they are there, they're positive, but they're pretty small. But many of the benefits are actually felt in North Wales for the Broughton Airbus factory, etc. So they do extend far beyond. So just your thoughts on local spend having local direct benefits. Do we get locked into that mentality too easily?
Yeah, so I think in terms of economic benefits of innovation, there's a huge amount of work being done to try and measure who benefits when there are innovations in the economy. And one of the nicest examples that I think we're all very well aware of at the moment is clearly the invention of vaccines against COVID-19 is pretty good for the economies of the places where the vaccines were developed. So if you invested in BioNTech in Germany 3 or 4 years ago, and most of the investors are in Germany, you're doing extremely well out of it. But you're doing nowhere near as well as the whole of the rest of the world that now is somewhat able to reopen their economies, live somewhat closer to normal lives, and have more people alive. So the dispersion of innovation activity means that we don't always see all of the benefits where the spending happens. And in fact, we probably see a sufficiently small amount of the benefits where the spending happens that we should really focus on getting the most amount of innovation for our money in the hope that it spreads, rather than spreading the money we spend on innovation. So in terms of, would I want to put an innovation centre for advanced manufacturing in Scarborough? No. I would want to put my innovation centre for advanced manufacturing in Rotherham, which is nice and close to Sheffield, where I can hire lots of fantastic engineers. And what would I do in Scarborough? I would tax the companies that are making more money from doing advanced manufacturing, whether that's McLaren, whether it's Airbus. I would tax them a little bit more and make sure that the things that really will support Scarborough's economy and will improve lives there are what we spend there, probably not R&D. So my suspicion is that we really need to focus, when we're talking about R&D spending, we need to be quite brutal about it. R&D spending by the state should exist to increase economic growth. The reason why we don't want it all to be in one place is because we know, because of where business spends, that the opportunities aren't all in one place. Business chooses more than one place to spend its money on R&D in the UK. It's not stupid. The UK government should be learning from business and saying, well, we should look a bit more like that. But it shouldn't be saying this chance to spend lots and lots of money on a spaceport in Cornwall is going to develop a fantastic space economy in Cornwall. It seems unlikely to me, because I've not seen a huge amount of private sector investment in space technology in Cornwall.
Okay.
So
Good.
let's focus.
Yeah. Okay. That's very good. Dan, I come back to you. One of the other tensions, again, related, or one of the issues to resolve is, I'm being slightly crude here, and you're going to be much more sophisticated than I am, is, Tom's made this, but university-led or business-led seems to be a sort of tension or issue. Just your reflections on that dilemma or that tension. How do you see that playing out? Where would you like to see that kind of go? You're going to tell me it's not either or. I get that, but it does come across in some respects as either or. So forgive me for being crude, but just your thought on that.
No, you're right. You have preempted my answer. And, you know, I'm an idealist. I always think the sector's better when it holds hands together and presents a united front. And I do think there's a lot to be said about the interplay between business and universities. As I've said before, universities very much are found at the hub of business enterprise centres. They're a catalyst or a catapult. They attract the sort of innovation players around them. So yeah, I mean, I would like to see sort of more talk about that, where especially the those kind of academics that are practitioners in their fields as well. You know, academics don't all sit in the ivory tower wearing their lab coats. Many of them are out on the front line in business and industry, and they take what they learn back into academia. There needs to be much more permeability between the two sectors, and we need to be speaking about it.
Okay, very good. Tom, you're you've touched on it already. What's your sense at the moment as to why, you know, you said the UK is a sort of outlier or exceptional case where public R&D doesn't necessarily follow private R&D? I mean, what's your sense as to why that is the case? And therefore, you know, what's the tension or dilemma in that? There must be is there a good reason why we don't do what everyone else does?
Well, the reason, I can't claim it's a good reason. The reason why we do this, in my opinion, is, and we should say, universities are critical to any innovation system. In all countries, universities are by far the biggest part of public spending on innovation, and they should remain so. It's just in the UK, they are almost all of it, and in Germany, they're just most of it. So we have more of these kind of non-university private research institutes in Germany, even the Netherlands, even France, and we probably should have more of them. Why do Oxford and Cambridge dominate the discussion around higher education in London, in the UK? Well, they are close to London. All of the politicians went there. They have a complete grasp of the debate. They're able to massively influence things. And to come back again to COVID, I was absolutely astonished that the UK government, which I don't think anyone can claim has done particularly well at managing COVID, always looked to the Imperial College model. Let's have a look at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine model. Like, Liverpool School of Tropical Medicine was older, has a lot of great people, and no one was really asking them. And the reason for that is its proximity. It is, are you close to power? Are you therefore listened to? Who is close to power? Oxford, Cambridge, London. They've done very well at focusing spending on universities. Now, I say it should carry on, but if we decentralize a little bit of the money, we will find that it gets spent a lot more on applications of technology. And I think applications of technology is really important. The University of Leeds was really founded as a wool research institute. Right? It was about saying, what does Leeds do? It spins wool. What should we set up? A wool research institute. 20 years later, someone says, I want to find out why wool shrinks when it's wet, and they win a Nobel Prize for discovering the structure of proteins, right? That's how innovation works. You can start from the very practical, and still make the deep science insights. The key to it is being somewhat, controlled and pushed forward by what your local business interest is. In the case of the north of England and the Midlands today, I mean, I think it's astonishing that and this will scare some people, but I think it's astonishing that the West Midlands manufacturing industry has not been able to capture government and achieve billions of pounds of spending to support its own interests in the way that happens in Germany and France. Let me tell you, if you go to Toulouse, a huge amount of the French government's R&D spending is just, it says, how do we make Airbus more profitable? And in Germany, they say, how do we make Volkswagen employ more people? And in the UK, we don't have, how do we make sure that the future of online fashion retail has to be Manchester? Why isn't there a boohoo.com innovation centre funded with loads of public money? Why isn't Bet365 supported directly through some gaming innovation fund by the UK government in the Northwest? And the reason for that is that the universities have a bigger hold of the spending, and I think we would do well to reduce their power a little bit. They should still be the most important part of the system, though.
Very good. Diana, do you want to come back to that? Because then I want to move on to, we've had several questions. By the way, all the questions I'm putting up are pretty much, I'm just paraphrasing what we're getting through. Quite a few are asking me to ask the questions, some shy on as we get back into September. But Diana, do you want to come back on that reflection?
Yeah, I'm just musing over what Tom said, because some of you might know that my previous job was working at the University of Warwick. I see my successor online, so hello. And that was something that I was thinking about as well when I was in that role, about sort of better leveraging government's ear for investment. And I think this is where metro mayors definitely have a role to play, but they're still quite a new phenomenon at the moment. And I do think there's a case for, be it business or universities, to be harnessing the power of the metro mayors. We use it very much here in London as well. We're very lucky to have one. I'm aware that not all regions have one, but those that do really should try and get the ear of that mayor to try and get the money. And in the West Midlands, they've got Andy Street. I mean, what better links to the government do you need? So many of us have Labour mayors. So. That's
a very good point. And if I can be, as is a day for being candid, I think that's a very, very good point. My observation on some of the mayoral or some of the mayor's contributions in this space is that they naturally lead into this inclusivity element, that they can't feel like they can say, this is about making our place kind of one of the innovation hotspots of the, of the globe. They also then have to almost immediately pivot to, and everyone can benefit and everybody can be involved. And I think therein is the dilemma. It seems to me that politicians, particularly place-based politicians, need to to grapple with as to what it is that they're trying to really articulate, which is an interesting kind of observation. I've got a question from Stephen. I haven't got your surname, Stephen, so there may be more than one Stephen on the call, so I apologize for this, but you've basically said one stated outcome of the innovation section of the Levelling Up white paper is to get to the 2.4% target. Particularly you, Diana, do you think that can be achieved without another innovation powerhouse outside the Golden Triangle? You've kind of alluded to the fact that you don't think that is the case, but I suppose one of the dilemmas is, does all of the Levelling Up agenda require more R&D money? Today we've had, we're going to get lots of money being allocated to the NHS and social care. Spending review in the autumn is going to be very tight for practically everything else, including R&D. Richard Jones musing on Twitter about how the government might fudge some of the numbers, how they get towards 2.4. Good thread if you haven't seen it. Does all of this Levelling Up innovation require much more money? Is that the only way we get there, given tall poppies and all of that, which is what you said, Diana?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in there.
Indeed, sorry.
No, I mean, if you'd asked me before COVID, like all of us, I was very excited with the advent of this new government and its big promises about science superpowers, largest investment in R&D, and I believed it. However, small problem of COVID's got in the way. Don't envy the role of the Treasury at the moment, trying to balance the books. Money's got to give somewhere. I would like to think that this government is still committed to science, and you can see it in some of the things that it's doing. It's brought the Office of Science into directly into the heart of power in number 10. There's definitely signs there that it is committed to the R&D agenda. But proof's in the pudding, right, when it comes to money. And there's lots and lots of things competing, not least NHS social care, as we're seeing this week on the public purse string. So I do think we need to be making the case now if we are going to get any rise or uplift in R&D spending. We cannot be taking it as a given, but as I said, we have the spending review coming up, so now is the time to prepare our wish lists, if you like. With regards to where that money should go, I agree with Tom. Nothing should be cut, obviously. I do not think by all means that London and the South East should remain the only golden triangle of the UK. As much as we're in a privileged position, there's no reason, and we don't want to carry the rest of the UK as how some people might see it. We want to share and share the love. So we would love no more than to see other parts of the country grow in their R&D presence as well and work in partnership to do that. But I think for the time being, at the moment, it makes sense to put that money in places where it's proven to work. And for now, that means Oxford, Cambridge, London, etc. Okay,
very good. I'm going to get Holly. Holly, I don't know, Holly Jones, you're on. If you're still on the call, Holly, can you unmute and ask your question about housing, because this will pick up on Tom's point. So Holly, fire away and then we'll go for it.
Yeah, thank you. I did ask it before Tom made his little jibe at Oxford earlier, but it was just about the long-term sustainability of these areas if the R&D has been put into them. So Oxford, Cambridge, London are all sort of notoriously expensive areas to live in. Bristol, where I live, is increasingly so. I know there's a couple of other Bristolians on the call. So I was just interested in what you feel the effect of the housing crisis in the south of England will be. I mean, I could afford to buy in Bradford or Leeds probably, but not in the south of England at the moment. So yeah, I was just interested in that. Thank you.
Yeah, very good. And so great question. And in part, it begins to, as always, connect different aspects or elements of the levelling up agenda, because it's all very complicated and all the rest of it. Everything relates to everything else and so on and so on. But Tom, you were sort of, we've talked about this before. I share your view, in a sense that we would ideally want Oxford and Cambridge in this current phase of industrial development to essentially go through the phase that Manchester and Leeds went through back in the day, when they grew from not very much to quite considerable urban areas, albeit they might do it slightly differently. But your thought on this and the implications for levelling up.
Yeah, so this is probably where the two worlds meet, and I think it's absolutely essential to understand it. Probably 5 years ago or so, the Joseph Franchi Foundation did a lot of work on inclusive growth, trying to measure what made a place able to share the prosperity it generated. And pretty much the more prosperous a place was, the more inclusive it was. This was on their measurement of it. And the exception was London, because no one could afford to live there. They were paying too much of their rent. They were getting higher wages and paying too much of their rent on it. This is the kind of death spiral of any argument for R&D spending. If the R&D spending, if all it does is make housing much more expensive so that everybody's profit and earning on their extra income due to greater economic growth, if that all gets taken and given to landlords who don't do anything, if it all gets given to landlords, you better not doing it. And we hear this a lot when we talk about innovation in the north of England. The classic phrase that I tear my hair out is we don't want to be the next Silicon Valley. All right, you do want to be the next Silicon Valley, but you also want to make sure you build 2 million homes, right? Build loads of homes so that people can still afford them. Invest in transport so that people can afford to commute in from somewhere a bit further away. And if you do that, you're probably going to be fine to accommodate as much extra R&D spending as the state can fund. If you're not going to, if all we do through R&D spending is transfer money from the state to landlords in Oxford, we shouldn't do it. It's just not a good investment for the country in terms of well-being, happiness, and all of the levelling up people side of things.
Very good. Thank you very much. Diana, your thought on this. Obviously, London, very expensive, in part driven by those sorts of investments that make it a very favourable place for businesses and higher end earners particularly to be. You know, your kind of question there, the dilemma about, I suppose, attaching maybe an R&D decision to a housing decision, for example. You know, I mean, that you see that in some, you know, becoming more and more, you see this in some respects through different debates. What's the sort of tension in that space?
Yeah, well, I mean, Tom said it all really, and you're talking to the right person here. Someone who's finally got themselves on the London property market, albeit leasehold this year. I know the struggles, and the more I'm calling for R&D for London, the more I'm thinking, oh, you know, other people are going to be in this situation as well. But in a way, I suppose COVID, you could see it's got a silver lining to it in the sense that there is more of a new normal now. It's less of, you know, less pressure for people to be in a certain place. There's more remote working, so London could still be in a hub, and I think it will still be a hub, but in a very different way. It opens out that commuter belt a little bit, as Tom was saying. We are very blessed in the southeast to have a public transport system that works. I realise that's not the case elsewhere in the country, and I wish it were so. But that gives workers and sort of employers a little bit more flexibility. So we should see the benefits of London expanding a little bit further, I expect, as we go forwards. But you know, time will tell, and we've got to see how the new normal sort of pans out. But I mean, the government's certainly thinking along these lines. I mean, in the PM speech that I alluded to on levelling up, who pretty much said, you know, we don't want to invest in those places which causes congestion, housing prices to go up, and public transport to malfunction. So the government is very much thinking about this, and I do think any decision will be taken in line with housing and sort of, you know, general quality of life.
Very good. Last question to you. We've had a couple of on this as well. Just give me a sense on the dilemmas associated with sort of taking forward the innovation agenda. You know, the kind of, is this a central government remit that they should just plow on with, notwithstanding, you know, they might do it differently, or is there a kind of local element to how this proceeds? Tom, give me your thoughts on that.
So the most interesting part to me of what's happening in innovation in government at the moment is, I don't know what's happening in Bays or anything like that. I don't know what discussions there are. There is this new thing which Dominic Cummings tried to get set up and is now apparently getting set up, called ARIA, Advanced Research Innovation Agency. The rumour is that they're going to put the headquarters in Canary Wharf, which will cause me to possibly, you know, smash something. But I do think that type of funding and the ability to say we're going to get out of the current system and have some money assigned in a bit of a different way would offer the opportunity to get closer to business. Universities would follow business because they are very good at working with business, but I think you would be closer to business. The dream for me would be not that it was in Canary Wharf, but that it was in Derby, but we'll see what they decide. And the reason for that is just, I think that we should be closer, more people should be closer to having the discussions and shaping the funding decisions that get made. And it's a pain to get to Canary Wharf, so let's not put it there. But there is something as well. You talked about Metro Mayors, Diana talked about Metro Mayors. I think that's really important. I cannot stress enough how little central government in the UK understands about the innovation ecosystems of anywhere. That includes East London. I mean, they don't know the innovation strengths of this country anywhere. So the chance of them knowing what the innovation ecosystem strengths are of Teesside are zero. And Ben Houchen, I say, as the elected Metro Mayor of Teesside, I'm sure he doesn't know, but he knows who to ask. And that's a big step forward. So if we could get some money, similar to what's trying to be done with ARIA, to innovation pots that are managed by Metro Mayors, I think that would be brilliant. And the reason that we won't let it happen is that the UK government will say, we need innovation pots for everywhere. Don't do that. Give it to the Metro Mayors. Just get it done.
Very good. Diana, last thoughts from you.
I think we're going to finish in alignment, because what Tom has just alluded to is something that I've been calling for a long time. What we need is the national government, so Treasury, to actually cough up the cash for R&D, but for the actual decision making to be done by Metro Mayors who know their regions, or as Tom said, know the people who know their regions better than anybody. And I think only that way can we have the investment that will really work for each part of the country.
Very good. Thank you very much indeed. It's 11 59. We could go on, but we can't. As I said at the beginning, a recording of the event will be made available on our website. You can get all the work that we've been doing and others on our website as well in relation to levelling up, centreforcities.org. My great thanks to our two brilliant contributors, speakers, Tom and Diana. Thank you for you coming along, posting your questions. We got through quite a few of them. Apologies that I didn't get to all of you. I covered quite a few of the questions that were posted. Next time, maybe get a few of you more to ask your questions. Our next event is next Tuesday, so a week today, September the 14th, where we're going to pick up in a bit more detail this point that maybe we finished on, which is the dilemmas and trade-offs associated with delivering levelling up, as in who should be in the lead and what's the balances between local led and central government or national led, but more details on our website. So that's a thanks to everyone, particularly to Tom and Diana. Thanks to all for coming. Until the next time, stay safe and take care. Thank you very much indeed. Bye for now.